Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of Vertebrate Zoology. Today, we're going to talk about how fish had the right tools to enable that next stage of evolution. That's going to be the focus of our next unit. So, here is a marlin or a sailfish. Sorry, it's a sailfish. And this fish is obviously adapted to an aquatic lifestyle. It's probably the most adapted in that it lives in very deep waters, very rarely comes in shallow waters, and thus is adapted completely to an aquatic lifestyle, meaning high mobility with a large home range and a strong predatory instinct. Right? So we've already said the story of how this sort of fish came to be. So the next step is what happened to them? Well, before we get to that, let's talk about the world that sort of fish would inhabit. So we talked about how by the Ordovician period, you had all the major lineages, or at least the very beginnings of these major lineages, that will become what we call fish, right? Whether it's bony fish, whether it's sharks. We saw the development of the jaw, which was a huge advantage. And over time, as the jaw got refined, you started seeing more and more elaborate forms. Now, during this time in the Ordovician, you saw the beginnings of that, but then there was that big extinction, right? The late Ordovician mass extinction event, the Lome event. Well, shortly after, it was pretty quiet. The ocean still had life. Many fish species and many fish lineages persisted into the Silurian. We haven't talked much about the Silurian, but it was basically a period of, fairly warm temperatures and fairly stable conditions, right? Beyond sort of the background levels of volcanism and stuff like that. And this continued well into the Devonian. So by the Middle Devonian, what we now refer to as the Age of Fishes, you saw, in the beginning, the cartilaginous fish kind of being the dominant um, vertebrate class, if you will, vertebrate group, not class. I got to be careful with those kind of words. But eventually being overtaken by the bony fish, right? So by this time, by the later Devonian period, you have the age of fish, but you're seeing this sort of succession from cartilaginous fish to bony fish. So by the end of the Devonian, most of the types of fish that we're going to see in the fossil record from now on, the origins of which kind of got their start there. So it really was truly an age of fish. They were the dominant thing. They were very large, many of them, apex predators occupying almost every type of niche that would have been available to a vertebrate at that time. And above the oceans, or beyond the ocean, sorry, you also started seeing that intrusion into fresh water. So you started seeing lineages not only make their way from saltwater to freshwater, but also evolve into distinct lineages themselves, to the point where often they would recolonize oceans. So you had this, what they call evolutionary interchange between these two very different environments, right? So all this was happening in the water. Now, what was happening on land? Well, at this point on land, you started seeing the beginnings of more established ecosystems. Now, the reality is, ever since the Cambrian, you started having larger and larger continents, right? And the very, very beginnings of the Earth would have been tiny little fragments of land here and there. But as you got to the Cambrian, you started getting the beginnings of continents, right? And of course, they would move around, right? You know about continental drift. Now, the reality was there was probably always photosynthesis happening on land because very likely algae, which would have originated in the ocean, would have probably colonized shallow waters on land, at least along the coasts of these continents. So that was always there. But now what you start seeing is a whole new class of organism, right? Plants that are starting to take over on land, forming large wetland environments. Now, many of these plants would have been what we call the lower plants. So you're thinking about things like bryophytes, for example. Eventually, mosses, club mosses, horsetails. These would give way to things like ferns, right? And eventually you have full-blown forests. So there would have been forests full of really large ferns. Everyone knows what a fern is. and eventually conifer trees. So conifer plants are things like pine trees and things like that, evergreens. And a key thing about them is they produce seeds, right? They're gymnosperm, so they produce a small naked seed, hence the gymnosperm. That's Greek for naked seed. So the Devonian was a time of great diversification of plants on land. Now, you have these plants on land, what we call the Devonian plant explosion. This is sort of the first big pulse of terrestrial life. And during this time, you also had arthropods living in these places, right? So I believe we watched a video um, in class with sea scorpions and things like that, right? So you had the beginnings of arthropods coming onto land. And by this point, you're getting well established, not only arthropods, but annelids, worms, and things like this, right? Now you have all these plants on land, and photosynthesis is happening. So what is it doing to the CO2 levels? Well, it's causing them to slowly decline, right? So as they're declining in CO2 levels, you're also starting to see increases in oxygen. However, I want to emphasize that this is a very gradual thing that you see over a long period of time. So the Devonian world would have been a very interesting world to walk around, right? And I would have loved to have gone back. Now I'm a big geography buff. So what was the world map at this time? Well, during the Devonian, you basically had one sort of really large supercontinent, if you will, which is Gondwana. So most of the things that we now consider being in the southern hemisphere would have qualified for this. So South America, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, but also some other large land masses like the Arabian Peninsula, parts of the Middle East, Antarctica as well. Of course, I forgot to mention them. That's the preeminent southern hemisphere thing. Anatolian Plateau, or what we call Turkey. So all these would have been together into essentially a large supercontinent, right? So that's what this picture is showing here. But you also had other areas that served more as like large islands, right? You had Laurentia, which would have been the North American continent, including all the islands up in Canada, or many of the islands in Canada, all of them, parts of Greenland, as well as the northern British Isles, Ireland, places like that, Scotland. You had Scandinavia and part of Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Baltica. You had sort of Central Asia, so all the Stan countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, all those countries would have been, Kazakhstania is what the term is for there, Siberia, as well as China, right? So all of these areas would have been essentially large islands at this point. Now, this is a map, and it shows not only the continents, but also these little black dots, which are showing where tetrapods are found. And tetrapods, of course, are the lineage that we ultimately belong to. So if you notice from their distribution, they're not really present on Gondwana like that. They're mostly in these islands. But these islands, which we now associate with the northern hemisphere, if you look closely at the map, they would have had a much more equatorial distribution. Right? So these places that we now associate with cold, and environments like Scandinavia and North America, well, these would have been much, much warmer during this time, right? Simply from a byproduct of being on the equator. So compare the land masses then with the land masses now and their distribution. So in the Devonian period, a significant the vast majority of land would have been in the southern hemisphere with Gondwana, but also those islands those continental-sized islands that would have been in and around the equator, right? So the northern hemisphere, by comparison, was largely just ocean, right? So it's a very different environment to think of as compared to now, where there is less landmass in the southern hemisphere compared to the northern hemisphere. And regardless of which type of map you use, of course, there's distortion that comes with different maps. But that generally is the case, that there's less land, more ocean in the southern hemisphere compared to the northern hemisphere. So good things don't last forever. The Devonian period didn't last forever. It ended with an extinction event, as often is the case. This extinction event is not this, ultra quick thing. This is actually something that played out over, tens of millions of years. But based on the fossil record, you see two major losses of species, right? The first is what's known as the Kellwasser event, and this basically is something that caused a great deal of extinction in sort of the ocean, right? So what went extinct? Well, a lot of trilobites. Now trilobites did persist a little bit, but a lot of lineages died out. Various brachiopods, shellfish, corals, and as well as some of those things like the ostracoderms that we talked about, and the placoderms and canthodians. Those sort of species, a lot of them went away. And then later on, there was another event, another pulse. So kind of like I think of it as a two-pulse extinction event. The Hangenberg event, which not only affected marine ecosystems, but appeared to also affect some of the land ecosystems, especially with arthropods. So you see this decline, and again, we're talking about a major extinction event that essentially played out over many years. So we don't really know exactly what happened, and obviously it plays out over a long period of time. It could potentially encompass a lot of things, and there's no reason to think that it would have been one thing specifically. It could have been a multitude of things. So one thing that is known is that based on geologic evidence, that you had conditions in basalt rock at the bottom of the ocean that represented anoxia, or at least the occurrence of anoxia. So if you don't know what anoxia is, it basically means the lack of oxygen, right? So this is an interesting, event. Obviously, you could make, if you have a lack of oxygen, you could certainly have what it takes for a large extinction event. But what actually caused it, we don't know. So the further back you go, we know less about these extinction events. One hypothesis is the good old-fashioned bolide impact. A bolide is basically a term for a meteor. You'll be surprised to know that about 20 or so, maybe between 15 and 20 meteors hit the Earth every year, right? And then many of them, of course, get burned up in the atmosphere. They're shooting stars or whatever, and they're, of course, varying sizes, right? Often these occur over ocean. Often these occur in very remote places. Small ones do occur in populated areas on occasion, and sometimes you hear about them, sometimes you don't. So this is a map showing bolide impacts, I think, from a few years ago. This would have been, I would have got this around 2020 or so. So they're very present. Some of the other sort of usual players is some kind of change in volcanism. Both, having a lot of volcanism as well as meteor strikes would have not only had their, the immediate impacts, but they would also have changed the climate, which is always the big thing, right? Possibly getting a global cooling happening. And if you have a global cooling happening, well, that could change a lot of parameters, right? Not only temperatures, but also influence the development of ice sheets and things like this, right? Glaciation. So there's that. And that, of course, would have a downstream effect on sea levels, which could explain the marine environment having issues. Another thing is that Devonian plant explosion, right, that caused all this life on land to suddenly thrive. Well, the presence of vegetation, especially large vegetation and expansive forests, is going to doubtless change the geology of the place, right? It's going to change how water moves through the environment, which is also going to change erosion. And, having a forest is going to, of course, change the atmosphere, which could impact the climate. And it's also going to encourage things like erosion, right? So if you all of a sudden have all these plants, and these plants are breaking into the rock, and they're producing soil, so now you have soil, but you also have rain, and rain drives soil into the water bodies, into the rivers and the lakes, and eventually this makes its way to the ocean. Well, this could have a very big impact on coastal communities. How do you think that would be? Well, one thing about erosion is it carries runoff. Runoff is often just a pseudo fancy term for the movement of nutrients, right? So having expansive forests and erosion that gets into freshwater bodies and eventually into the ocean, well, all of a sudden you're giving large pulses of nutrients into coastal waters. And especially if you're doing this in hot conditions, as you know, in Florida, hot conditions, a lot of nutrients, you're going to get eutrophication, right? You're going to get algal growth. And when you get algal growth, you also will eventually get algal death. And you probably know just from eutrophication, this still happens today, that what will often happen is you will, as the algae die off, as conditions change, they settle on the bottom, they get broken down by bacteria, and all of a sudden you're producing anoxic conditions, right? Because of anaerobic respiration of bacteria. So, yeah, we don't know for sure, but that's a very interesting premise, and there's a lot of evidence to support this, but we don't know for sure, right? It's still continuing research. So, either way, extinctions are extinctions, and they provide opportunities. And if you happen to survive this, you will get many opportunities potentially. Um, this is a question posing. We know about the dinosaurs. We've heard the story about how the death of the dinosaurs, little rodents, rodent-like creatures, were able to, go on and take over, and eventually became all the mammal lineages that we're associated with today, as well as ourselves. And that's how we got our big break, right? Um, Truth of the matter is that it did play out like that. We'll get to that later. But some of the other things you also consider, right? Here's a list of possible benefits, right? You're streamlining the number of species that are out there, right? There's going to be more resources available to you if you happen to survive. That means you'll be able to reproduce a lot more, have a higher survivability a lot more, especially if you've gotten rid of a lot of your predators. And also, you now can potentially occupy a whole suite of new niches, right? So whatever predisposition you have, you can now take advantage and basically find your niche. And whenever you have that sort of situation, what's going to happen is you're going to encourage evolution, right? You're going to have a lot more mutations. You're going to have a lot more divergence. You're going to get a lot of just by going into new areas and new habitats and taking on new roles, you're going to, of course, slowly adapt to that new role, right? So now all of a sudden you're going to get these radiations, right? Simply meaning that you start from a few founder species and you'll all of a sudden create a whole suite of new species just from the fact that you're taking over a new environment. So great opportunity if you can make it. Okay, so after the Devonian period, we now enter into the Carboniferous period. The plants on land are still going strong. You're starting to see conifers take over, all these very interesting plants that you would have been like pine forest slash rainforest type plants. And you're now getting a very large expanse. Again, the majority of your um, especially your more temperate continents are going to be in the equator, right? So you're going to get a lot of sun. You're going to get a lot of nutrients now, and you're going to start to see very big habitats form. So in the Carboniferous, about 300 million years ago, you had this very sort of wet tropical kind of environment, and having all these forests are going to do something to your CO2 levels. Well, basic photosynthesis, right? CO2 levels should start to decrease, and O2 levels, as a result, which is the product of photosynthesis, are going to start to increase. So if this is happening, what's going to happen with temperatures over time? Well, CO2 nowadays is being blamed for increasing temperatures. So if CO2 is declining over time, you'll start seeing this global cooling effect, right? And that's exactly what you see. So you get an environment that's basically transitioning from being really hot to essentially cooler over a period of time, largely driven by the presence of plants in a huge way, right? Now, the high oxygen levels are great because some species find them as, or some um, invertebrate groups find them as basically a limiting factor on their body size. So having higher O2 levels allows larger and larger creatures to inhabit these rainforests. So this was the age, the Carboniferous was the age of a lot of things, and one of the things it's best known for is it was the time when there were giant insects. You may have heard of Meganeura. Meganeura is basically a large dragonfly. It would have been about the size of, say, a hawk, maybe even an eagle, right? So you could just imagine a dragonfly zipping around, the incredible predators that they are, about the size of an eagle. That would have been quite a thing to see. On the other end, other arthropods, primarily arachnids, which were also undergoing quite a radiation at this time, you started getting these large ground-dwelling arachnids, most famous of which is Mesothelae. Mesothelae is kind of thought of as a large trapdoor spider, but in a lot of ways it kind of looks more like a tarantula, but it would have been this large thing that would have been about the size of like a desk, right? 1.5 meters long, and would have been running around an active predator, chasing prey down, right? Now, during this time, you also had, I got to mention this plant. This is Lepidodendron. And Lepidodendron is pretty well established in the fossil record. It has very noticeable fossils because the bark of it looks like scales, so hence the term scaled trees to describe them. And this is actually the defining fossil of the Carboniferous period. Now, there's quite good evidence to suggest that Lepidodendron was the dominant plant in the world at that time, right? So this would have been a whole, genus or family, I don't remember, of plants that would have basically occupied the majority of land, right? It would have been the dominant tree where it was found. So this is very important. Do you have any idea what this is? Why it matters? Like I said, it's an establishing thing about the Carboniferous. Well, these trees were trees, and then they stopped being trees, and they died off. And as they died off, their fossilized remains were under significant pressure and heat, and ended up producing things like coal. So the reason we call it the Carboniferous period is because this is where a lot of our fossil fuels are derived from this time, and it's actually thought that most coal, as well as certain types of oils that that we extract as fossil fuels, the fossil fuels are these lepidodendron trees. So these scale trees might be the thing, these scale trees that existed 300 million years ago might be the thing that has allowed our civilizations to industrialize and for all the wonderful things that you have, all those wonderful amenities and the laptop or computer that you're watching this thing on right now, all of that might have been possible because of the existence of these trees 300 million years ago. So show some respect to these trees. You're unlikely to see one now, but if you ever did, I expect you to thank them for their service. So by the end of by the Carboniferous, by the Middle Carboniferous, all these continents through continental drift have basically consolidated into the large and famous supercontinent of Pangaea, right? This was a gradual thing again. And you got to remember that when you have something like a Pangaea, where you have one large continent, and there were islands, right? There were some islands and large continents that were kind of around it, but for the most part, it formed a large land that can be essentially traversed from one side to the other, right? But at the same time this was happening, you also had one large ocean. So geography back then would have been very simple. It would have been Pangaea, and then you would have had a panthelastic ocean, which just means like all ocean in Greek. That's what it is, panthasa, all ocean. And then you also had sort of like a little gulf or the Paleotethys Sea. Now you got to remember that the distribution of continents and continental shelves These are the things that give the ocean its character as well through their effects on currents, their effects on weather, right? So we don't know much about what the currents would have been like. We probably would have had very intense currents along the continent, but then the rest of the ocean, we don't know. Was it stagnant? Was there a little bit of flow? Was the flow mostly driven by the Earth's rotation? Who knows, right? Um, what we do know is that when you have a large continent, even if you're on the equator, you're producing conditions on land that are can be quite difficult. Along the coast, you could have more temperate climates. You have warming from the water. You'll have frequent precipitation. But as you move further away from the coast, you get more of a continental environment. Very, very dry, very big swings in temperature, right? Could be very hot days and very cold nights, very hot summers, very cold winters, right? The sort of things that you would see now, say, in the middle of Asia. So if you were to go to like a Kazakhstan or places like that are far away from the coast, landlocked, they're places that can get very, very hot and dry in the summer, and they could be very, very, very cold in the winter, right? So it's a very difficult environment to adapt to. So very likely life was mostly concentrated on the coast with much less diversity in the interior of the continent. So we're going to talk a little bit about that transition to land. And this is a slow story that will take our time. But I just want to emphasize the idea of pre-adaptations. The pre-adaptation is just like the name suggests. It's something that you have that is going to allow you to adapt to something in the future, which means that these adaptations, these pre-adaptations, would have been there for filling some other sort of purpose. And then when the environment changed and the opportunity arose, those adaptations can now be used for something entirely new, which gives you a leg up on the competition. Right? So we'll talk about this. This is Tiktaalik crawling onto land out of the water. We'll talk about him later on. But I want you to think about being a vertebrate. You're in the water, and now you're moving on to land, right? What are the sort of challenges you're going to encounter? What sort of things might be helpful in the water and may allow you to take advantage of something on land? And what would be the reason to get onto land in the first place? Why invade land if you're successful in the water? So these are big questions. And I don't expect you to have immediate answers right away. But it's good to give it some thought. Right? I want you to think about, what it is to be a vertebrate. What does it mean to be a vertebrate in the water? What does it mean to be a vertebrate on land? Why come onto land in the first place? Right? And what could help you do that? Usually when I say why invade land, most people jump on one of two things, either to get away from predators, or more often than not, there's some food resource on land that somehow this fish in the water knew about and was tempted to get on there. We don't know exactly, but we can make some pretty good guesses. So normally in class, what I would have you do is pick one of these topics here and compare fish and mammals for these different challenges and think about how they meet them. But I would argue that these are the 6 biggest things that you have to deal with as you make the move from water to land, right? At their most fundamental level. And of course, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Sometimes they're kind of related, right? But gravity, viscosity, we'll talk about what that means. Gas exchange, how do you do that? How do you balance your water? How do you deal with the temperature changes? How do you get energy? So what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of go through these sort of one by one. We'll start with gravity. Now, obviously, if you're in the water, you're floating. You have the water column to help you. You have buoyancy, right? And the effects of gravity are going to be much, much less than on land. As you transition from water to land, you need to deal with the fact that you are now responsible for maintaining your body above the ground, right? You no longer rely on buoyancy. And you see this echoed when you look at things like the skeleton. right? Both bony fish and mammals and reptiles and whatever group you want to look at have ossified skeletons. But the way they're ossified is different. In the case of a fish in the water, well, if you've ever like looked at fish bones, or you'll know that you can bite through fish bone, you can crack a fish bone fairly easily, right? They have an example of what we call woven bone. Woven bone is just a simplest ossification of cartilage. It's still living tissue, so there's blood vessels running in and out, but there's no reinforcement because they don't need it, because they don't rely on their skeleton so much for supporting their body as they do for motion, as they do for a place for muscles to attach and pull on itself, right? To allow them to move. So they have what we call woven bone. As opposed to, once you start needing your skeleton to support your body weight, well, now you sort of have to reinforce it. So if you look at the bottom picture here of the two bone cross sections, you have lamellar bone. And lamellar bone basically looks like layering, right? That's what lamella means layering. And you basically have a layering where it looks like almost like a reinforced, pieces of wood or something like that, right? And by having these layers, right, just like on a tree trunk, if you cut it and you look at the tree rings, by having these layers, you're basically making it stronger, right, and more dense. And by making it more dense, you're better able to resist gravity, right? So just like a fish bone might be breaking one pencil in half, take a bunch of pencils together, a handful of them, and then try to break them all at the same time. You're going to have a lot harder time because they're reinforced. Same thing going on with the bone. What else is going to happen? Well, you're now not relying on the water to keep you up. So now you have to use your limbs. Over time, what's going to happen is your limbs are going to move underneath your body. You're going to increasingly rely on where your limbs contact the ground to support your weight. And in order to facilitate this, you're now going to start to develop your trunk. And especially what I'm talking about is your pectoral girdle and your pelvic girdle, right? So your chest area is the bones, you have these flat bones, your scapula in the back, right? You have your clavicles up front, you have a rib cage now, and you're going to support the front part of your body. And on the hind end, you now have the fusion of various bones into this large bone structure, your pelvis, right, which is actually multiple bones fused together, and then your limbs run off of that. Okay? So now you're starting to get this development. At the same time, they're connected by the vertebrae, right? And the vertebrae are going to become increasingly specialized, and we'll talk about this, right? But you might already be familiar with the sections of your vertebrae. So your vertebrae, or your spinal column, runs from the base of your skull to the tail end. And if you remember the sections, you start with cervical, thoracic, lumbar, then you have your sacrum, and then your coccygeal, which the sacrum and the coccygeal both are vertebrae that are fused, right? Which will eventually become your tailbone, quote unquote, right? And they actually become the central part of your pelvic girdle. So this specialization is going to help you, right? At the same time, you're making your joints stronger. You're putting cartilage to enable for a range of motion as well as to provide support. Those bones are now basically out of whack, away from, they're not just kind of hanging off of you, they're now kind of attached. Whereas if you're a fish, you may have a pelvic fin, but that pelvic fin is kind of floating and it's held together with muscles, but now it's actually a detachment with the bone. So a lot of big changes. These little things become huge, right? And the best way to look at it is like to compare it with sort of engineering, right? You want to support a body of an animal. Well, you're basically going to use the same strategies as you would to support anything else. So imagine you were building a bridge across a river or something like that. You would build a bridge basically in the same way as you would build, a body, right? You're supporting yourself, right? And a good bridge doesn't need any sort of external support. It can support itself. Well, the best way is by reinforcing the middle, right, and having really good leg supports, right? So it's much the same way. So there's a nice little analogy. I always like this particular analogy here. And you can see the various parts of the vertebrae. In a typical sort of mammal, the caudal vertebrae and the sacral vertebrae are separate and they're kind of distinct vertebrae. Obviously, vertebrates have a tail, right? Many of them. Now, at the same time, your spine is also going to be articulated. So an articulation is basically where multiple bones meet, right? You could have a simple joint of two bones, or you could have more bones attaching. Bones are areas for muscles to attach. So the more articulated an area is, the more range of motion you're going to have, right? So for example, if you want to talk about the rotator cuff, which is your shoulder, well, you have a wide range of motion. You could spin it around in either direction. You can move it out, backwards. It's probably the most articulated joint you have. But you have these in your vertebrae as well. Specifically, you have your vertebrae, and in between them, you have the vertebral discs or the intervertebral discs. These are just, little donuts of cartilage that obviously separate your vertebrae, keep them from rubbing, and provide a little flexibility. But you also have these spinal processes that come off of the vertebrae, right? They're actually called spinous process. And these are also interlocked with each other at places called facet joints or zygapophyseal joints. And these also provide a little extra support, right? So for example, you can bend your back, you can bend over, and you can do all these things, and you can do this while supporting a little bit of weight. And the reason you can do that is because not only you have these intervertebral discs, but you also have these facet joints, right? So over time, this is going to be a big advantage to vertebrates as they evolve to cope with being on land. Now, the other thing is you also have to get blood to where you need to get blood. So you're going to have a heart eventually that's going to move from being this small little structure in a fish, which is located right by the gills, that has the basic job of just getting the blood to the gills so they can get oxygenated again and then sending it to the rest of the body. You're now moving from being right by the gills to kind of a more centralized location. You're also producing a greater and greater heart, stronger and stronger heartbeat. You're providing more what they call cardiac output, more blood per beat. And what's going to happen is this is going to act to increase your blood pressure. If you ever try to take blood from a fish, you know that you have to wait forever because they have very low blood pressure, right? So you use it in, capillary tube, or you make a little puncture and you just, draw it up a capillary tube, or you could use a needle if it's a bigger fish. It takes forever to get a blood sample. In a mammal, if you get the vein, you're good. You get blood samples very quickly because there's a much higher blood pressure. You're also on land, which means you're also fighting gravity. So because you're fighting gravity, well, you need a stronger heart to be able to move the fluid against gravity. So this perfect example here is the giraffe, right? The giraffe is getting blood to its head. It's able to do this by having very high blood pressure, among other things, right? So over time, what's going to happen is you're going to go from having a single loop for your circulatory system to eventually dividing it into two parts. The part that oxygenates blood, or what we call the pulmonary circuit, and the part that gives blood to the rest of the body, or what we call the systemic circuit, right? So this is going to be a major trajectory. The heart's going to become more refined. You're going to start having more and more chambers, culminating in the four-chambered heart that we have, and you're going to see an increased separation between what's oxygenated blood versus deoxygenated blood. At the same time, you're also going to have this alternate universe of circulation, what they call the lymphatic system. In case you've ever wondered what your lymph nodes do, the main thing they do is they recover intracellular fluid, or extracellular fluid, that's just made its way out of the circulatory system and bring it back into the circulatory system. So it's basically there to save your, save your plasma, basically, from being lost all the time. So this is a big advantage as you move onto land, right? Now, viscosity. Viscosity, what I'm referring to here is the fact that unlike being in the water where everything is wet and everything is essentially encased in this fluid that you are able to take and bring into your own body, which is also made of fluid, You now live in an environment that's drier. You're not surrounded by fluid anymore. So even simple things like feeding have to change to adapt to this. So when we talk about viscosity, if something has very high viscosity, we're talking about something like maple syrup, for example, that runs very slowly, or honey. Low viscosity would be something that's more runny, right? Now in the case here, we're talking about the difference between living in a liquid versus living in a gaseous environment, which is where we actually live, right? We're surrounded by air, not by water. So the first thing and most obvious thing is you're going to have to change the way you feed. A fish can open its mouth, suck in food, and that food is already surrounded in a fluid, can get broken down by enzymes, and that fluid milieu will become part of the fish's fluid milieu. On land, it's a little different, right? You can't just you have to actively get your food. You have to manipulate it. Fish don't really have much of a tongue. Mammals and vertebrates on land have more of a tongue because they need to be able to manipulate food, whether it's a chameleon or a frog having to catch its food from far away, or if it's a mammal having to move food around in its mouth while it's chewing, right? You also have to produce a fluid to allow you to bring the food down your digestive tube, right? This is what saliva is for. Saliva has a number of purposes. It does have enzymes and stuff that helps to break down food, right? Especially carbohydrates with amylase enzymes. But saliva is also there as a lubricant, right? It surrounds the food and encases it and allows you to digest it, right? Remember a while back they had that cinnamon challenge and stupid people were like downing cinnamon powder, and it was kind of dangerous. Why? Because you're doing the thing that you're not supposed to do. We evolved saliva to deal with that exact situation of taking in dry things, right? So I know saliva and spit. I get it, kind of gross, but think about where your life would be. What kind of life would you be living if you didn't have saliva? It would be a pretty shallow life, if you ask me. Obviously, another thing is also you're starting to see changes in how the mouth looks, right? You start seeing more of what they call a rostrum, which is basically a snout. You start seeing teeth organized in a certain way. You start seeing a separation between the mouth and the nose, right? The nares are becoming their own thing, mostly for respiration. You don't breathe through your mouth necessarily. The reason you don't breathe through your mouth is because sometimes you got food in there, but you still need to breathe. The rostrum, as it develops, you start seeing teeth align a certain way. You start seeing the differentiation of teeth. You start seeing teeth taking on different roles. You have the grabbing teeth in the front, you have cutting teeth, and then you have chewing teeth in the back, right? And of course, mammals take this to the extreme. So you're starting to see that gradual evolution. You also are starting to see less and less of those muscles, which collectively we call the hypobranchial muscles, that are associated with those gill arches, right? So in the fish, they had all these muscles that held their gill arches in place. They served as attachment points for their oral jaws as well as for their pharynx jaws, or pharyngeal jaws. Um, you start seeing these decrease, in part because they start to become more refined. You start seeing these various bones attached to the hyoid, or sorry, the various muscles attached to the hyoid bone. And the hyoid bone is shown in this picture here. You have where this guy's neck, you can see this little bone attachment at the top of the larynx. That's an attachment spot for a variety of muscles that control not only neck and neck movement, but also jaw movement, right? So the lower jaw, as well as the tongue. So a very active place, but all of these muscles are becoming smaller. It allows them to basically less important, but more refined movements, right? This will eventually lead to us allowing to talk too, by the way. So a lot of things going on with viscosity. Now, what about the obvious one? You no longer live in the water. You now got to breathe gas, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. How do you bring in the oxygen? How do you unload the carbon dioxide? Very fundamental difference between these two gases. Carbon dioxide loves to be in water. So if you're in the water, it's very easy to eliminate carbon dioxide just by sheer contact with the water. Carbon dioxide will slowly dissolve out of you, just like it does in fish with the gills. On the other hand, oxygen doesn't like to be in water. It prefers to be a gas. So getting oxygen out of the water is a little trickier. The flip side is the reverse is true on land. On land, getting oxygen is easy. It's all around you. 21% of the atmosphere is oxygen molecules. You can suck it in pretty easily. But then the hard part is getting it out of the air in your lungs into your bloodstream, which is liquid, right? And on the flip side, carbon dioxide is building up in your blood as you live. You've got to get rid of it. You have to have a mechanism for taking it out of the fluid, which it likes to be in, and forcing it out into the air. And there's a way this works. But it involves obviously your lungs, right? So your lungs are basically very thin membranes that are inside your body. Obviously, you breathe in, breathe out. You know this. You know how they're attached. You know that they're very flexible. They can expand quite a bit. There's a lubricant fluid there, pleural fluid, which is located in between sort of the membranes of the lung. And it relies on something called tidal flow. So just like a tide goes in, tide goes out, tide goes in, tide goes out, the same thing happens with air in your body. Unlike gills, where the water just rushes past your gills and comes out the other side, and it's a unidirectional flow. In the case of lungs, you're bringing air in and then you're dumping air out through the same hole, right? Your mouth and nose. So there's a challenge with that. And if you rely on this sort of method, a key thing that your body does in most circumstances is to increase surface area. So if you live in an environment where you have a hard time getting oxygen out of the atmosphere, one thing you can do is just make more contact between your body and the atmosphere. So increased surface area, if you look at the inside of a lung, it's more than just like a bag that inflates and deflates like a balloon. It's actually filled with tiny little sacs called alveoli. And this is where the gas exchange occurs. Right? So the more of these you have, the higher your chances of getting the oxygen you need from the environment and getting rid of the CO2 you don't need into the environment. You're still walking around as a bag of water and you want to keep it that way, right? You're 70% of your body, they say, is water, give or take, but you always run the risk of losing it to the environment. So what can you do? Well, first you can insulate yourself from the environment, right? Endotherms, or what we call warm-blooded creatures, we'll talk about that later, have insulation. Part of that is to protect themselves and their skin in terms of temperature as well as water loss. Um, all sorts of elaborate mechanisms for maintaining water balance or using our water to cool ourselves. So close relationship between water balance and temperature here. You also have scales, basically. As you move on to land, especially in the early stages, especially if you look at reptiles and things, you have keratin, right? Keratin becomes essentially the outermost layer. It's waterproof. It becomes part of your epidermis. It does wear over time, but it's very resistant to wear. When it does wear, you can just shed it off, right? Fish don't really shed their scales in synchronous ways like lizards and snakes do, right? Over time, those scales will get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? To the point where they just become kind of a skin layering. And then you also have, not only one layer, the epidermal layer, but you also have a dermis and you have a hypodermis. Hypodermis can have fat. A dermis can have all sorts of, other things like hairs and stuff like that, all embedded inside it. And you also have lipids that provide sort of waterproofing, right? So these could be, either things like triglycerides and adipose deposits, or they could be something like a waxy ester, like a waxy layer. Either way, it prevents water from escaping, which is a big thing, especially if you're taking on, the land of ancient times, a lot of which was arid and dry, right? So here's a picture of two things doing this. So next time you see a bird like this osprey, which is probably not going to be an osprey, but if it ever does anything on your car, just know that it's not taking a crap on your car. It's actually just pissing on your car. It just comes out solid and white because of those uric acid crystals, right? Whereas a dog or a bear like this one, it's going to be a liquid form. So the other thing is you're also on land, which means you have to reproduce on land. Now, external fertilization is something that can be done in the water, and if you're a species that's tied to the water, that could be where you go to reproduce. So if you think about amphibians, we know, right? It rains and triggers amphibians like frogs to go to their local pond, lay eggs, call for mates, and external fertilization happens. But if you're on land, that gets increasingly difficult. You now are seeing the transition from external to internal fertilization being the norm. Not to say that there aren't internal fertilization that happens in the water. Obviously, we've already talked about fish and things like that can do that. But you start seeing it becoming the norm because it sort of has to be. On top of that, when you do finally fertilize an egg, you hope that egg can survive, right? So you start seeing the development of the amniotic egg, which is basically an egg with buffers from the external environment to basically provide a watertight environment. So this is what you see in oviparous species. Now, the other option you have is to produce live young, right? So instead of having the egg in the environment mimicking water, you can have an internal fluid-filled environment to raise offspring, right? So now you have, live-bearing reproduction, viviparity becoming normalized as well. So all these are a byproduct of the fact that you're just not in the water anymore. If you're also not in the water anymore, you're now going to deal with very big fluctuations in temperature. Nighttime temperatures in the ocean are not going to be that different from daytime temperatures in the ocean because the ocean is a buffer, right? Same thing goes for seasonal temperatures, right? You get cold water, warm water, but there's not going to be as drastic and as quick as those differences that you can see on land, especially if you're far away from any moderating effect of a coastline. So you're going to see thermal regulation being an increasingly important part of being an animal, right? So what are you going to do to thermoregulate? Well, a lot of options, right? You can change your behavior, right? You could hide in a burrow. You can bask when you're cold. You can hide in a burrow when you're cold. You can bask. You can hide in a burrow when you're warm too, to avoid overheating. You can bask to warm up your body temperature. You can have varying types of insulation. You can change how you move your blood around, right? You can vasodilate sometimes, like to get rid of heat. You can produce sweat, or you can, shut down your circulation in some places and concentrate them in your core to keep yourself alive, like you do in the wintertime. If you're ever up somewhere where it snows, your ears and your nose are often the first places that feel cold. You don't tend to notice it until you go into a warm place and they still feel kind of numb. That's because you're cutting off the circulation there, right? You can also fluff up your feathers, make your hair stand on end, all sorts of things.
The sun's heat and power to evaporate water has had a profound effect on the bodies and habits of everything that lives here. This sun, potentially, is a killer. And the red kangaroos must acknowledge that. Right now, while the sun is low, there's no immediate cause for concern. But this situation won't last long. Australia is the world's most arid continent with blistering daytime temperatures. Every hour, the temperature rises by 5 degrees centigrade. Soon, the heat will reach a critical point. Any kangaroo out in the open is in serious danger of overheating. In the full sun, the temperature on the ground soars to 70 degrees. By midday, the radiation is so intense they must take shelter. In the shade, they're shielded from much of the sun's energy, but their body temperature can still rise. So they lick saliva onto their forearms, where there is a network of blood vessels close to the surface of the skin, and as the saliva evaporates, their blood is cooled. This thermal image shows just how effective the process is. The blue areas on the body are the cooler parts. As the saliva dries, it has to be replaced, and this is a real drain on the kangaroo's body fluids. Even in the shade, the earth is baking hot. So the kangaroos dig away the warmed topsoil to get at the cooler ground beneath. By staying in the shade and licking to control their body temperature, kangaroos manage to get through the hottest part of the day without heat stroke. But for the majority of desert animals, this strategy would not be enough for survival.
So I love how there's very dramatic music for what basically was let's get out of the sun and go into the shade. But you see their behavioral adaptations, you see their specialized adaptations as far as cooling, digging out the thing, the topsoil so they can get into the cooler area. So no shortage of potential strategies for dealing with very hot temperatures or very cold temperatures on the flip side, right? Now, what about energy? So when we talk about energy, what we're talking about is how do you get energy? How do you use energy? So obviously there's feeding and there's feeding strategies. I don't want to get into that. But one thing people don't think about is how do you find your food in the first place? So one thing you see with that transition from water to land is a whole new suite of sensory information being used by animals to find food, mates, etc. So you're no longer in the water, so relying on things like electroreception, like your lateral line, or the movement of currents, or things like that, are not going to work anymore, right? We sort of co-opt some of that, especially when you look at the lateral line eventually becoming the adaptations that allow us to hear things and allow us to feel balance. But you're now living in an environment that's dry, so you've got to have a way to keep your eyes moist. A fish doesn't really have eyelids, doesn't need them because it's in contact with fluid, and as long as it's in contact with fluid, it doesn't dry out. In the case of land animals, you now have to have specialized adaptations like eyelids, tear glands, ways to make the eyes, to keep the eyes moist and functional. You are now co-opting those hair cells from your lateral line and using them as part of your hearing, but you also have this problem of you're having to hear things vibrating all around you, but they're occurring very subtly. You can't detect them. So you have to have a way to amplify sound waves, for example. So you now see the development of a middle ear where, okay, you have your hair cells in your inner ear. We'll get to these things later. but you have to have a way to amplify the sound so it's even detectable. So the three smallest bones that we have are our middle ear bones, right? Which basically help us take a air signal and turn it into a water signal. And they amplify the sound and produce the equivalent of water waves for every sound wave they hear. Pretty crazy stuff if you really think about it. You also start seeing, because you're living in an environment where things can travel very far away, right, through the air, even faster than it can in water. You now have an elaboration of things like chemoreceptors that allow you to tell scent, right? So you start seeing pheromones, for example, and the various organs that are required to detect them. Vomeronasal organ being one of them. Your nose, as well as turbinates to help you with dealing with that kind of outside environment. Now, all that stuff is floating around in the air. Your body is water. You have to have a way to transition those chemical signals into something there. So you have specialized structures to help you do that. And then finally, you're in air. So you have to have a way to move your body around and to know how much muscle you need to do certain actions. You no longer rely on buoyancy. If you have to pick up a 50-pound thing, it's a 50-pound thing, not a 50-pound thing that may or may not float in the water. So because you have to do that, you have to have a very good awareness of your muscles. So you start seeing the development of proprioreceptors, which are basically specialized structures that allow you to detect motion. For example, each of your muscles have spindles inside them, which are sensory information that prevent you from overstretching your muscles and prepare you to pick up things or move things around or to put load on your muscles. So quite complicated stuff.
What most people think of when they look at the world, they think other animals probably see the world pretty much the same way. And only with time do we realize that, of course, other animals don't see the same things we see. That takes us to a sort of a philosophical question is, what is the animal actually seeing? It's impossible to know because it goes into a brain that's very alien to ours. It goes through processes that we don't use when we process visual stimuli. The animal does things with that information that we don't do, so it's really hard to know. The most simple eyes just tell an animal when it's light and when it's dark. And then you've got eyes like ours that have color vision and very, very good spatial vision and can see very complex detail.
The development of eyes can be categorized into 4 stages, from simple to complex. Stage 1 is the simplest form. Light falling on just a few photoreceptors allows an animal to sense light and dark. At stage 2, organisms can now tell which direction light is coming from. In stage 3, 2 distinct eyes appear. The first is a cupped eye with more photoreceptors. The second is a compound eye that adds more cups. Both types in stage 3 can produce crude images of objects. In stage 4, the most advanced eyes perform complex visual tasks. Lenses, corneas, and irises focus light on photoreceptors, creating sharp, clear vision. This entire evolution, from simple to complex, could theoretically happen in less than 500,000 years.
People have asked me if I could be any animal at all, what animal would I like to be in terms of their vision? It would only be right to say this since I work on them so much of my time. I would really like to know how mantis shrimps see the world. Their perception of the world is so different, both in terms of their sense of color, their sense of parts of the spectrum that we don't see at all, and also the way that their eyes are multiple, so that each eye sees the same thing multiple times from different points of view. I think I'd probably, if I got myself into the mind of a mantis shrimp, I'd have no idea what was going on, and I would never be able to tell myself, oh, this is how they see. That's the thing that I'm afraid of. But I'd still like to spend at least a few minutes seeing how a mantis shrimp sees the world.
That's very cool. Great sort of quick evolution of the eye there. We'll get into that as we move on to other things and the role that eye and color vision plays and all that. Let's try another type of sense that's probably not as cool as the mantis shrimp, but still pretty cool.
Even the strongest nose on Earth can't smell certain things that this snake can smell. Because the snake's super smell uses two different high-powered organs together. This snake has nostrils on top of its head, plus an extra feature called the Jacobson's organ. This organ is a sensor, and it allows snakes to detect chemicals in its surroundings that could lead it to prey. Enhanced smell for the hunt. When this snake, and this snake, and this snake snap their tongues, they're collecting chemical information about their environment that can't be detected through an ordinary nose. Pheromones, for example, are chemicals that allow animals to send signals to one another. A bee will release pheromones to attract other bees. This mouse's pheromones will influence the behavior of other mice. And with the help of the Jacobson's organ, this python can sense their pheromones. First, the snake's tongue flips in the air. When it retracts its tongue, the snake inserts the forked tip inside its head into the Jacobson's organ, which allows the snake to detect the mouse pheromones, providing extra information to use to track its prey. Nose, tongue, and Jacobson's organ work together. And in an instant, the hunter prevails, thanks to a tongue that can smell.
So two totally different types of sensory information, both of which are using different forms of energy to produce a sense, right? To allow these animals to move through their environment. So we'll leave it at that for today. We're going to get to that talk about how things happened and transpired to where a fish like us can go from one watery environment to the dry and unforgiving place of land and everything it needed to do. So I'll leave you with this quote and these wonderful pictures of mud skippers. And till next time, have a good one.